Some people believe that Tarantino makes films without any real meaning, just filling them with colorful characters, catchy dialogue, and provocative scenes. They think there's nothing truly deep behind all of that. Of course, not everyone thinks this way, but even some respected critics call his work superficial. To back this up, here's a quote from James Wood, one of the leading film critics at The Guardian. Tarantino represents the ultimate victory of postmodernism, stripping art of any substance. Only in our era can a creator as talented as Tarantino produce work so empty, entirely devoid of politics, metaphysics, or any moral interest. Honestly, I'm exaggerating a bit, since this is just the opinion of one respected film critic about a specific Tarantino movie. But still, such views do exist. Today, using one of Quentin Tarantino's characters as an example, I'll try to show how deep philosophical and social themes can hide behind what seems like a simple and even somewhat comedic character. I'm talking about Oswaldo Mobray from The Hateful Eight.
Oswaldo?
Yes.
We'll discuss themes of justice and fairness, as well as the views of sociologist Max Weber and philosopher John Locke. And you'll see that Tarantino's films often contain much more meaning than they might seem at first glance. At first glance, Oswaldo Mobray, whose real name is Pete Hickox, is a member of the Domingre gang. By the way, why Domingre and not Domergue like daisies? I'll explain that a little later. The gang consists of Marco the Mexican,
Bub.
Grouch Douglas,
Joe Gage.
Jody Domergue, Daisy's brother,
And I'm Jody.
and Pete himself.
Oswaldo Mobray.
These four head to Red Rocks to save Daisy, who is being escorted to her execution by John Ruth. Somewhere along the way, they run into the real Oswaldo Mobray, the Red Rock executioner, and decide to get rid of him to use his documents as cover. Once they learn that Ruth and Daisy will have to stop at Minnie's haberdashery for the night due to the bad weather, the gang decides to set up an ambush there. However, they don't take into account that John Ruth is an experienced bounty hunter, always on alert and nearly never puts his gun down. So they realize that a direct attack is too risky and could lead to casualties on their side.
We are still gonna be facing John Ruth, chained to my sister with a pistol pointed at her belly. So the name of the game here is patience.
The situation becomes even more complicated when it turns out that along with Ruth, there are two more armed people traveling, bounty hunter Marcus Warren and the self-proclaimed sheriff Chris Mannix. Although he might actually be a real sheriff.
What did she mean when she said the bounty hunter's nigger friend in the stable?
He's got a nigger bounty hunter friend in the stable.
But all that just got her.
Pete and his gang decide to act cautiously and come up with a plan. They poison the coffee. As a result, John Ruth and the driver die after drinking the poisoned brew. However, Marcus Warren, teaming up with Chris Mannix, takes control of the situation.
Anybody does anything, and I mean anything, you kill them.
In the end, during a shootout, Pete gets wounded and shortly after takes one more bullet, this time a fatal one.
Stands, Chris. You ain't done nothing we can't forgive. Sit out of snow with Daisy and Grace.
At first glance, Pete Hickox's storyline seems like just a short tale of an ordinary outlaw. Tried to free his accomplice, got shot, and died. But in reality, it's Oswaldo who becomes the conduit for key philosophical and moral ideas that Tarantino weaves into the plot. For example, it's Oswaldo who suggests dividing Minnie's haberdashery into two parts, something we'll come back to later.
We divide Minnie's in half, the northern side and the southern side.
He also delivers perhaps the deepest monologue in the film.
And if you're found guilty, the people of Red Rock will hang you in the town square.
Pondering the nature of justice, the moral dilemmas of punishment, and the role of the executioner as a representative of the law.
And after busting down that door, they drug you out into the snow and hung you up by the neck. That would be frontier justice.
He raises complex questions like, what is true justice?
But ultimately, what's the real difference between the two? Well, the real difference is me, the hangman.
These musings directly reference the work of sociologist Max Weber and his concept of the monopoly on violence. Max Weber was a German sociologist, philosopher, and economist whose work had a significant impact on the development of social sciences in the 20th century. He is considered one of the founders of modern sociology and the author of concepts that still help us understand society, power, and the state. One of his most famous ideas is the monopoly on violence. Weber formulated it in his essay, Politics as a Vocation, 1919, at a time when the question of what makes a state legitimate and how it maintains power was especially pressing after World War I. According to Weber, the state is the only structure that has the exclusive right to use physical violence within its territory. This means that only the state can use force or delegate this right to its institutions, such as the army, police, and courts.
And if all those things end up taking place, that's what civilized society calls justice.
Any other violence outside of these boundaries is considered illegal.
That would be frontier justice.
This idea has had a profound impact on the study of power, the state, and its role in society. In the film, the executioner character of Oswaldo Mobray represents someone who acts officially on behalf of the state and dispassionately carries out their job. Through this character, Tarantino raises an important question. What makes violence legitimate?
Yeah, Warren, that's the problem with old men. Kick them down the stairs and say it's an accident, but you can't just shoot them.
For example, shooting a general out of personal hatred is a crime.
If you shoot this unarmed old man, I guarantee I will hang you by the neck until you are dead.
But if you provoke him into attacking and kill him in self-defense, it becomes a legally sanctioned use of force.
So what you gonna do, old man?
In the character of Oswaldo Mobray, we can also see a reference to John Locke's theory of the social contract. John Locke was a 17th century English philosopher who played a key role in the development of political theory. In his work, Two Treatises of Government, he presented the idea of the social contract. Locke argued that initially, people exist in a state of nature where they have rights to life, liberty, and property. However, in such a state, there are no guarantees for the protection of these rights. To ensure their safety, people voluntarily agree to form a government, a structure that, as we've already discussed, becomes the sole holder of the monopoly on violence. Within the social contract, citizens transfer some of their rights to the government in exchange for the protection of the rest. At the same time, the government is meant to be a neutral arbiter that maintains order and justice. Locke also advocated for the separation of powers into legislative, executive, and judicial branches to prevent abuse of power and safeguard citizens' freedoms. Furthermore, he emphasized that if the government violates the contract, usurps power, or acts unjustly, the people have the right to restore their rights. But the legitimacy of violence, the social contract, and the monopoly on force are far from the only ideas Tarantino embeds in the character of Oswaldo Mobray. Remember how Oswaldo suggested splitting Minnie's haberdashery into two parts, the northern and southern sections?
The fireplace side of the room acts as a symbolic representative of Georgia, while the bar represents Philadelphia.
In reality, even after the Civil War ended, racial hostility and social contradictions continued for many years. In many southern states, there was still strong resistance to the ideas of equality. I've already discussed this in one of my previous videos about the Hateful Eight, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. Now, Oswaldo's suggestion to divide the haberdashery into two parts actually confirms that everything happening inside Minnie's is a metaphor for the United States, torn by social and cultural contradictions. It's as if Tarantino unfolds a miniature model of America before us, where each character represents a piece of this conflict. In this context, Oswaldo Mobray becomes a symbol of the legacy of the British Empire, whose influence is deeply rooted in American history. After all, it was from the British North American colonies, such as Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, that the first 13 states eventually emerged. After years of colonial rule, Britain began facing resistance from the colonies, especially over issues of taxation and lack of representation in the British Parliament. This conflict grew into the War of Independence, during which the colonies severed their ties with Britain and declared their independence in 1776. Many British people at the time considered themselves culturally and socially superior to the Americans, viewing them as descendants of colonists who had strayed from British culture. The Americans, in turn, often made fun of the British accent and slang. Oswaldo Mobray embodies this sense of superiority, often ironically and critically reflecting on American culture. He is notably gallant, overly polite, and stiff.
Allow me to assist you, madam.
All typical traits of the British, who considered British English more proper and refined compared to the American version. It's especially interesting to see how Oswaldo is outraged that Joe Gage confused the New Zealand accent with real British English.
Very sweet little accent. Where's that from? England?
I take exception to that.
This could very well be an ironic nod to the myth of Britain's cultural and linguistic purity, even though in reality, such differences are often exaggerated. Most of us are used to thinking of British English as purer, more proper, and more ancient, almost like the golden standard, the language that Shakespeare once spoke. But in reality, there's an interesting paradox. Despite the proud British tradition, it's actually in America that the language has preserved some older features that have already disappeared in Britain. For example, the famous British habit of not pronouncing the R sound after vowels. This phenomenon is relatively recent, emerging in the late 19th century. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when Britain was still the metropolis for the North American colonies, the pronunciation of the R sound was the norm. And here's the paradox. The way the R sound was pronounced in America from the very beginning is how it's still pronounced today. While the British started dropping the R sound around the 19th century, Americans kept it. British English underwent significant changes during this period, and what we now perceive as the classic British accent, with its formality and unique sound, is actually a relatively recent result of linguistic evolution. At the same time, many features of Old English have remained largely unchanged in America, preserving earlier forms of pronunciation and grammar. So it turns out that Oswaldo himself, with his manner of speaking, is a product of the evolution of the British accent and style. If you still think that Oswaldo's British origin doesn't matter much, and that Tarantino just made him British for fun, here are a few more interesting connections. As I mentioned, the characters in The Hateful Eight represent certain social groups that played key roles in the formation of the United States. But that's not all. The four bandits embody different forms of colonialism and expansion that left their mark on the country's history. Oswaldo Mobray, the British and self-proclaimed executioner, symbolizes the British Empire. His accent and appearance remind us of Britain's legacy.
Oswaldo Mobray, madam.
Bob the Mexican, speaking Spanish, strangely represents Spanish colonial influence. Spain was one of the first empires to begin the colonization of America, and its culture, language, and influence on the southwestern U.S. are still noticeable today. Jody Domergue, with his French surname, represents the French Empire. In the film, he even speaks French with Minnie, emphasizing his connection to France.
Merci beaucoup, mademoiselle Minnie.
The French heritage is felt in places like Louisiana, and Jody, as a representative of French culture, adds another historical layer to this symbolic model. Joe Gage, the classic cowboy and embodiment of American westward expansion, represents the ideology of manifest destiny, the brutal idea justifying the conquest and colonization of new lands, regardless of the consequences for indigenous peoples. These four are in Minnie's haberdashery, a kind of improvised country, not for peaceful coexistence, but to deal with its inhabitants. They bring with them force and aggression, embodying the expansion and colonialism that form the foundation of U.S. history. As for the other characters, it's worth mentioning Six-Horse Judy from New Zealand.
Auckland? What the fuck's in Auckland?
That's where I'm from. It's our biggest city. New Zealand.
As is well known, New Zealand was once part of the British Empire. The Dutch also played their part in the formation of the U.S., having founded the New Netherland colony in 1614, which covered what is now the U.S. The capital of this colony was New Amsterdam, situated on what would become Manhattan. Later, in 1664, the British took over New Amsterdam and renamed it New York in honor of the Duke of York. Thus, the Dutch legacy became part of America's history and cultural background. As for African Americans, Tarantino certainly couldn't avoid this theme, and their presence in the film only strengthens the overall symbolism.
You want to know why I lie about something like that, white man? Got me on that stagecoach, didn't it?
The Battle of Baton Rouge mentioned in the film is a real historical event from 1862, when Confederate forces tried to capture the city, which was under Union control. But this isn't the only Battle of Baton Rouge. In 1779, Long before that, Spanish troops under the command of Louisiana Governor Bernardo de Galvez attacked a British garrison at Fort New Richmond, located where present-day Baton Rouge stands. This battle was part of Spain's struggle against the British, adding another historical layer to this place.
But I strongly suggest we don't restage the Battle of Baton Rouge during a blizzard in Minnie's haberdashery.
Another interesting observation is related to the surname of Jody and Daisy DeMurgo. As I mentioned, this is a French surname, but then why is the gang called the Gang of Jody Domingray?
If you really want all that Domingray gang bounty money...
Yet the document clearly states Domergo.
Yeah, I take it you're Daisy Domingo.
There is a well-founded theory about this. The gang frequently ventured into Mexico, hiding from the law, so it is likely they kept Bob there, who had connections in the country. Daisy also mentions that they are heading to Mexico.
We go to Mexico, you go on to Red Rock, get that star pinned on your chest.
This played a role in cultural adaptation. Their Mexican companion, Bob, likely just adapted the complicated French name into a more convenient form. Thus, the French Domergue turned into a more Spanish-sounding Domingray. Perhaps Johnny just liked how the name sounded in a Spanish manner. The Spanish, like Minnie, liked the French pronunciation.
Oh, that's real nice. What is that?
That's French.
You speak French?
Oui.
What does that mean?
This is a typical example of how names and titles change and adapt over time, losing their roots. This process can also be observed in the naming of American states. For example, Louisiana is named after French King Louis XIV, and Georgia after King George II of Britain. These details emphasize how the U.S. is truly a multicultural country. Even in Tarantino's own filmmaking crew, we see this phenomenon. Channing Tatum has Irish, French, and Native American roots. The actress who played Judy Six Horses is actually from New Zealand, and Tarantino himself is a mix of Italian, Irish, and Native American heritage. Given all these numerous references and symbols, it becomes clear that this is not a coincidence. The Hateful Eight is not just a bloody Western in Tarantino's style. It's a deep reflection by the director on the roots of American history, the nature of power, and its legitimacy. In this film, violence is portrayed as a tool that can only be justified in the eyes of those who wield it.
I know Americans aren't apt to let a little thing like unconditional surrender get in the way of a good war.
And the monopoly on it is just a formality behind which human cruelty and the desire for control lurk.
Now that was a nice dance.
Every character, every detail in The Hateful Eight has its symbolic weight. The four bandits embody the empires that laid the foundation for America. Minnie's haberdashery is a miniature model of the U.S., where different social groups mix and where tension is ready to explode. Tarantino seems to examine under a microscope the chaotic intertwining of ideals, stereotypes, and contradictions that make up the history of this country. Thus, The Hateful Eight is not just a film about revenge and survival. It is a true allegory of American society, its dark sides, and the eternal struggle for power and justice. By the way, if you're new to the channel and haven't seen my previous video on The Hateful Eight, I definitely recommend you check it out. It's closely connected to this video, and in it, I tried to share my perspective on the meaning of the film. I think if you watch both, the whole puzzle will finally come together.